Welcome to the Fantasy Thinker. I'm Jared Quartermanch, and as you all know, occasionally I like to throw in a history book in my reading pile. Currently, I am reading The Earth Transformed by Peter Frankopan, an untold history, which relates climate change and, well, it's a lot more than that, and how it affects the history of our human race. But today I'm going to give some recommendations that can hopefully tweak that epic fantasy itch that we all have, and actually be history and related to how fantasy um, teams to work. Because I know a lot of fantasy draws upon a lot of historical references, and it's all over the place. So, um, including, of course, the original epic fantasy, historical fantasy, mythological fantasy, depending on what you want to call it. Um, the Iliad, of course, by Homer. This details the Trojan War. Um, there's a lot of fantastical stuff that happens in here, and then, of course, there's a lot of history in there, kind of. so, uh, that's so history and fantasy have been closely tied together for eons here. Uh, but the recommendations I want to make will hopefully give you that fantasy feel while actually being history. And maybe we can get some history readers out there too. So, if you want to start off with the big epic feel, the malazin feel, that beginning of the world to the you know that stretch of time that takes everything into consideration when reading your fantasy. You have books like Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. This details the fates of human societies. So it really goes from the beginning of uh, recorded history, all the way up to today, and it tells how these three items here, guns, germs, and steel, were the focus of a lot of civilizational changes and stuff like that. Really good book for that. The ultimate in complete human history is my favorite. I mean, there's a lot of them. Don't get me wrong. This isn't the only one, but my favorite is *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. A brief history of humankind. If you can call humankind's history brief at all, but it's only 400 pages. So yeah, he sums it up beautifully, and he gives you the whole scope of human history and all the reasons he has for why humans developed the way they did. So those are the big picture things. I have one more big picture thing here, also by Peter Frankopan, is the Silk Roads. This is a new history of the world that has more of a focus from, rather than European focus, a Persian focus. So it's a more center of the world focus that details a new history of the world from that viewpoint, rather than because we have so many Eurocentric viewpoints in history books, that this was a nice change of pace, and it gave you a different feel for how the history of the world developed. So those are the big ones that you know give you the whole span of history, which some of us like in our epic fantasy. Um, if you want to get more um, detailed, like in, suppose, like a nation building type um, fantasy. If you like that kind of fantasy, you can go into something like this: um, A History of Japan by Kenneth Henshaw. And something like this is really interesting because it just details a viewpoint of history from one nation's um, viewpoint. I've read stuff like that: History of Japan, History of Cambodia, History of, you know, uh, India and France and what have you. So those are good if you prefer your fantasy that only focuses like on a single nation. Um, and then you have your conqueror type history, or invader type history, where you want, if you like to read about some military battles where somebody's invading somebody or somebody's conquering somebody and those type of histories, you could pick up something like this, which details the life of Alaric the Goth, by Douglas Boyne. um, this is an outsider's history of the fall of Rome. So this is the fall of Rome from the viewpoint of the invading Goth barbarians. Um, and this was well done. Nice little short book. But if you like your epic fantasy where it takes that viewpoint of the barbarian invading the empire, that's a pretty cool book. Of course, the ultimate conqueror here is a little Genghis Khan, conqueror of the world history here. You know, greatest murder in the history of mankind. And yeah, this really gets into the nitty gritty of Leo Hartog. Yeah, gets into the nitty gritty of what Genghis Khan did, what he accomplished as a conqueror, and how he actually became a uh, world connector, because he actually connected a lot of the world together through his conquests, which were very brutal. But um, and if that's the kind of fantasy you like, where you have a conqueror conquering all these different places in a fantastic world, then you might veer towards that. Um, and or if you like something a little more pastoral, a little bit more farm boy, you know, um, who farm boy who's on a little area, very very narrow viewpoint on a village or something like that. You could pick up something like this, A Medieval Life by Judith Bennett. Um, this details the life of a woman named Cecilia Pennefather of Brigstock in England, and way back in the early 1300s. And this was a very interesting read because it really delved into what peasant life was like back then, rather than most things focus on nobles and stuff like that. So that was a very interesting read if you want to get that more down to earth pastoral focus. If that's what you like in your fantasy, maybe the early stories of somebody like Randall Thor, who started off as a farm guy, just from a little village somewhere. Of course, he went on to become a conqueror, but c'est la vie. And my favorite book of all is, for history wise, that is A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman. This book detailed the calamitous 14th century, specifically the time in Europe, in France, during the Black Plague and the Hundred Years' War between England and France. This really gets into the details of it. Follows one noble family, Anguerin de Coucy, throughout his lifetime here, a little bit before his life and a little bit after. Um, so this was a very detailed look of that time period, that history. It kind of relates it to the troubles that we were having in the 20th century too. But there was no better feel. Like when I was reading this, I got that feel of a great epic fantasy novel that followed this character around during this time period. And this would be my highest recommended as far as history books go. If you love epic fantasy and you think, oh, I might want to try a history book someday. Um, this one's my favorite. It's pretty heavy reading, so If you're used to like a malazin type heavy reading thing, you'll probably have no problem with that. But really, it was gripping. It was actually a gripping history book. So I don't know if I can give more praise than that. One other thing I wanted to go over with history and fantasy is the idea of maps. Um, you know, don't take the maps in fantasy books to be set in stone, or we shouldn't actually, because maps are malleable things depending upon who creates them. And if your fantasy world is at all reflective of our own world, maps may not always be completely accurate, and there should be room for interpretation in those maps. And I know Tolkien, of course, he had maps in the Lord of the Rings, and but I know his maps changed quite a bit over his lifetime. Of course, they publish the ones that are in the Lord of the Rings, and those are kind of set in stone for the books they're published in. But I know that his own personal history, he changed maps quite a bit. Um, and if you notice, even in the recent release of Malazin, the Forge of High Mage, there's actually a map in the beginning of the book and a map at the end of the book. And even though they detail the same area, one's a little bit more zoomed in than the other one is, they're a little bit different looking. And I think that's done on purpose. Uh, and there are some ecological changes in the book, not to give away anything, but that that reflect that a little bit. But even then, it's like, yeah, it's not, it's an interpretive thing, mapping, and it used to be a lot more interpretive way back in the day, as you can see by this really old map of what somebody thought the world looked like, compared to the detailed maps we get today. Of course, today it's very scientific, and we can get a lot more accuracy out of our maps. But uh, you know, even MapQuest screws up every once in a while, or Google Maps, or whatever you use. Anyways, those are recommendations for some history books. If any of you fantasy readers out there want to grab some history, those are the ones I recommend. All right, so thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe below, and be good to each other.